I said, "Sit down." The words exploded through first class like a bomb going off, followed by the sharp crack of flesh meeting flesh that made 20 passengers freeze in their seats. The slap echoed through the cabin, bouncing off the leather headrests and polished surfaces, creating a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. 3 phones immediately started recording. 7 more followed within seconds. And in that moment, flight attendant Jessica Martinez had absolutely no idea she had just assaulted the man who signed her paychecks. But before we dive into how this single moment of rage changed an entire industry and sparked a movement that's still rippling through corporate America today, I need you to do something. Drop a comment below with your city, because this story happened in the skies above all of us, and it could happen to any of us. And if you've ever felt invisible in a place where you belonged, if you've ever been judged by what you wore instead of who you are, smash that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to witness isn't just about one man and one flight attendant. It's about a system that was broken, and how sometimes it takes one viral moment to fix what should have been fixed decades ago. The man sitting in seat 2C, the one whose cheek was now bearing a red handprint, was Marcus Thompson. 58 years old, distinguished silver at his temples, wearing a simple dark hoodie and jeans. To Jessica Martinez, he looked like someone who didn't belong in first class. To the 20 other passengers, now staring in shock, he looked like a victim. But what none of them knew what Jessica Martinez was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just any passenger. He was the CEO of SkylineUS Airways, the same airline painted on the side of the plane they were flying in. The same company that employed Jessica Martinez. The same corporation that in exactly 47 minutes when they landed in Atlanta would begin the largest customer service overhaul in aviation history. The phones kept recording. The comments started flowing. SkylineUS scandal began trending before they even started their descent. And Marcus Thompson, the man who had spent 35 years climbing from ground crew to the corner office, who had flown combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, who had broken barriers and glass ceilings with quiet dignity, his entire life simply looked at Jessica Martinez and said in a voice so calm it was terrifying, "Ma'am, you need to step back now." But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story didn't start with a slap. It started 3 hours earlier in a Phoenix airport terminal, with a man who deliberately chose to fly coach on his own airline, who dressed down instead of up, who wanted to see exactly how his employees treated passengers when they thought no one important was watching. He was about to get his answer. Marcus Thompson had been invisible his entire life, and that's exactly how he liked it. At 58, he had perfected the art of blending in, not because he was shy or lacked confidence, but because invisibility was a superpower in the corporate world. When people didn't know who you were, they showed you who they really were. And after 3 months as the newly appointed CEO of SkylineUS Airways, Marcus Thompson needed to know exactly who his 23,000 employees really were when the cameras weren't rolling and the corporate policies were just words on a wall. He stood in Terminal 4 at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, looking nothing like a man who controlled a fleet of 847 aircraft and a budget that rivaled some small countries. His dark gray hoodie was soft from years of washing. His jeans had a small scuff mark on the left knee from weekend yard work. His backpack was generic black canvas, the kind you'd find at any Target or Walmart. On his feet were white sneakers that had seen better days. The only hint of his true status was the Rolex Submariner on his wrist, but even that was mostly hidden under his hoodie sleeve. Marcus Thompson was a study in contradictions. He had grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, in a neighborhood where airplane noise meant you lived too close to the airport for the houses to cost very much. His mother, Sarah Thompson, had cleaned offices at night to pay for his school clothes. His father, James Thompson, had worked double shifts at FedEx loading cargo planes, while dreaming his son might one day fly them instead of just watching them take off from his bedroom window. Marcus had done more than fly planes. He had flown FA-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf. He had logged over 3,000 hours of combat flight time. He had come home with decorations and commendations and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've been tested by fire and emerged stronger. But the skills that served him best weren't the ones he learned in flight school. They were the ones he learned growing up black in America: how to read a room, how to make yourself small when you needed to, how to observe without being observed, and how to keep your composure when people treated you like you didn't belong. After the Navy, Marcus had started at the bottom of the airline industry. Ground crew at Delta loading bags in the Georgia heat. Ticket agent at Southwest dealing with angry passengers who missed connections. Operations coordinator at United working midnight shifts to pay for his MBA. Every rung of the ladder, every department, every aspect of how airlines worked. He had spent 35 years learning the business from the inside out, and 3 months ago, the board of directors at SkylineUS Airways had bet their company's future on his experience. The bet was already paying off. In his first quarter, customer satisfaction scores had improved by 12%. On-time performance was up 8%. Employee morale surveys showed the first positive trends in 3 years. But Marcus Thompson knew that numbers could lie, especially when people knew they were being measured. He needed to see the truth. He needed to experience his own airline the way his customers did, without the protection of his title or the deference of his position. That's why he was standing in Terminal 4 at 6:47 a.m., looking like any other middle-aged black man trying to catch an early flight to Atlanta. No corporate jet, no first-class upgrade, no assistant to handle the details. Just him, a basic economy ticket that he had purchased online using his personal credit card, and a boarding pass that said Seat 2C. He hadn't told anyone he was taking this flight. His executive assistant thought he was working from home. His wife thought he was in back-to-back meetings. His children, both grown and living their own lives, had no idea their father was conducting the most important performance review of his career, 30,000 feet above the American Southwest. The woman who was about to destroy her career and change an entire industry forever was named Jessica Martinez. And at 6:47 a.m. on that Tuesday morning, she was already having the worst day of her life. She just didn't know it yet. Jessica was 32 years old, originally from Orange County, California, and she had been a flight attendant with SkylineUS Airways for 8 years. 8 years of serving drinks and pretzels, dealing with crying babies and drunk businessmen smiling when she wanted to scream, and keeping her composure when passengers treated her like she was invisible. She was good at her job, or at least she had been. But lately things had been falling apart. Her divorce from Bradley Martinez, a real estate agent, who had turned out to be better at selling dreams than keeping promises, had been finalized 6 weeks earlier. The settlement had left her with half of nothing, a credit card debt that kept growing, and an apartment in Phoenix that she could barely afford on a flight attendant's salary. She had applied for promotion to senior flight attendant 3 times in the past 2 years. 3 times she had been passed over twice for women with less experience, but better connections once for a man who had been hired 6 months after she was. Jessica Martinez was angry. Not just frustrated or disappointed, but genuinely deeply angry at a world that seemed designed to keep her exactly where she was. And when people are angry, when they feel powerless in their own lives, sometimes they look for someone else to control, someone they can push around, someone they can make feel as small as they feel. At 6:47 a.m. on that Tuesday morning, Jessica Martinez was looking at the passenger manifest for Flight 847 to Atlanta and wondering if this day could get any worse. She was about to find out. SkylineUS Airways Flight 847 was a Boeing 737-900 configured with 16 first-class seats, 42 premium economy seats, and 96 coach seats. The first-class cabin was arranged in a 2-2 configuration leather seats in charcoal gray, with brushed metal accents, each one wide enough for a full-grown man to sleep comfortably on a cross-country flight. The mood lighting was soft amber, designed to feel luxurious without being ostentatious. The overhead bins were larger than those in the back of the plane, and the flight attendant call buttons were actually answered with a smile instead of a sigh. At least that was how it was supposed to work. Marcus Thompson was among the last passengers to board, not because he was running late, but because he wanted to observe the boarding process. He watched from gate A7 as the usual hierarchy played out first class, and elite status members boarding first, followed by premium economy, then the general boarding groups. He noticed how the gate agents smiled differently for passengers with elite status, how their voices got a little warmer, how they made eye contact a little longer when his boarding group was finally called. Marcus Thompson walked down the jetway like any other passenger. No one gave him a second look. No one recognized him from the company newsletters or the CEO announcement that had run in trade publications 3 months earlier. He was just another middle-aged black man in casual clothes carrying a backpack and boarding pass, looking tired in that universal way that all travelers look tired at 7:30 a.m. The flight attendant working the first-class cabin was Jessica Martinez, though Marcus didn't know her name yet. She was positioned at the galley greeting passengers as they entered, but her greetings were selective. When Rebecca Chen, an Asian-American tech entrepreneur in her late 20s, boarded and handed over her boarding pass for seat 1A, Jessica's face lit up with professional warmth. "Good morning. Welcome aboard. Can I help you with anything?" Rebecca smiled back. "Just excited to be in first class for once. Work is finally paying off." "That's wonderful. We'll take great care of you today." When David Rodriguez, a Latino attorney in an expensive suit, approached with his boarding pass for seat 3B, Jessica's demeanor was equally welcoming. "Good morning, sir. First time flying with us." "Actually, no. I'm pretty loyal to Skyline US. Great service." "Well, we appreciate your loyalty. Let me know if you need anything at all." The pattern continued as the first-class cabin filled up. Sarah Mitchell, a white business consultant in her 40s, received a warm greeting and an offer to hang up her jacket. James Washington, an elderly black veteran, wearing a navy cap and walking with a slight limp, was greeted politely, but without the extra warmth, though Jessica did offer to help him with his bag. Marcus Thompson was watching all of this as he waited his turn to board. He noticed the subtle differences, the micro-expressions, the way Jessica's voice changed tone depending on who was in front of her. It wasn't overt discrimination, nothing that would show up in a formal complaint or a training manual. It was the kind of unconscious bias that happens 1,000 times a day in airports and hotels and restaurants across America, so subtle that most people don't even notice it happening. But Marcus Thompson noticed everything. When he finally reached Jessica Martinez at the galley entrance, boarding pass in hand, her demeanor shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible but absolutely unmistakable. Her smile didn't disappear entirely, but it became thinner, more professional, less genuine. Her eyes did a quick scan from his sneakers to his hoodie to his backpack, the kind of assessment that happens in milliseconds, but feels like an hour when you're on the receiving end. "Boarding pass, please," she said. And even those 3 words carried a different energy than the greetings she had given the passengers before him. Marcus handed over his boarding pass without comment. Jessica looked at it, then looked at him, then looked at the boarding pass again. Seat 2C, first class, window seat. her eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly. "Is this your seat?" she asked, and the question hung in the air between them like smoke. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice steady and polite. Jessica looked at the boarding pass one more time, as if checking for signs of forgery or fraud, then handed it back to him with the kind of reluctant acceptance that made it clear she wasn't entirely convinced, but couldn't think of a reason to challenge it further. "Seat 2C is right there," she said, pointing toward the window seat in the second row. Marcus Thompson nodded his thanks and moved toward his seat, acutely aware that he was being watched, not just by Jessica Martinez, but by several of the other passengers who had witnessed the interaction. Rebecca Chen, in 1A, had looked up from her phone. David Rodriguez, in 3B, had paused in organizing his carry-on. Sarah Mitchell, in 4A, had stopped reading her magazine. They had all seen it. The different tone, the questioning look, the subtle implication that maybe, just maybe, he didn't belong in first class. None of them said anything. Not yet. Marcus Thompson settled into seat 2C, placed his backpack in the space in front of him, and pulled out his phone. He had 17 unread emails, 4 missed calls, and 2 text messages from his executive assistant asking about a board meeting scheduled for the following week. He ignored all of them. For the next 3 hours, he wasn't the CEO of SkylineUS Airways. He was just another passenger, and he was about to get a very expensive education in how his own employees treated people who looked like him. The plane was nearly full now. The overhead bins were being closed. The flight attendants were beginning their final preparations for departure. Jessica Martinez was moving through the first-class cabin, checking seatbelts, offering pillows and blankets, making sure everything was perfect for takeoff. She offered pillows to Rebecca Chen, David Rodriguez, and Sarah Mitchell. She asked James Washington if he needed help adjusting his seat. When she reached Marcus Thompson in 2C, she walked past without making eye contact. It was a small thing. The kind of oversight that could be explained as an accident, a momentary distraction, the busy rush of preparing for departure. But Marcus Thompson had been invisible his entire life, and he knew the difference between accidental invisibility and intentional invisibility. This was just the beginning. The Boeing 737-900 pushed back from Gate A7 at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport at exactly 8:15 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule. The engine spooled up with that familiar whine that frequent travelers know by heart, and Flight 847 began its taxi toward runway 8R for the 3-hour flight to Atlanta. In first class, 16 passengers settled into their seats, most of them already pulling out laptops or tablets or books, preparing for the kind of productive flight that business travelers have turned into an art form. Marcus Thompson wasn't reading or working on his laptop. He was watching. Specifically, he was watching Jessica Martinez as she prepared for the safety demonstration that every flight attendant performs thousands of times in their career, the choreographed routine of oxygen masks and seat belts and exit row responsibilities that most passengers ignore completely. Jessica began at the front of the cabin, demonstrating the proper way to fasten and unfasten a seatbelt, as if the passengers in first class hadn't figured that out already. She moved methodically through the routine, making eye contact with passengers as she went, speaking clearly and professionally, doing exactly what she had been trained to do. She demonstrated the oxygen mask procedure for Rebecca Chen in 1A, making sure to explain that passengers should put on their own masks before helping others. She showed David Rodriguez in 3B, where the life vest was located under his seat, even though they would be flying over land for the entire journey. She made sure Sarah Mitchell in 4A understood the location of the nearest exits, which could be behind her as well as in front of her. When she reached row 2, where Marcus Thompson was sitting in the window seat, something interesting happened. She continued with her demonstration, but she didn't make eye contact with him. She spoke to the empty seat beside him, 2B, as if he weren't there at all. She showed the safety card to the air between seats 2A and 2B, but not to him specifically. She gestured toward the exits, but her eyes were focused somewhere just over his left shoulder. It was masterfully done, actually. To a casual observer, she was performing the safety demonstration exactly as required. She covered every passenger in row 2. She explained all the necessary information. She followed protocol perfectly. But she managed to do it all without acknowledging the existence of the man in seat 2C, as if he were a ghost that only she could choose not to see. Marcus Thompson noticed, of course. How could he not? But more importantly, other passengers were starting to notice too. James Washington in 5C. The elderly veteran watched the entire interaction with the kind of sharp attention that comes from a lifetime of recognizing patterns that other people miss. David Rodriguez in 3B glanced over during the demonstration, his lawyer's instincts picking up on the subtle irregularity. Most significantly, Rebecca Chen in 1A was not just watching, she was recording. She had pulled out her phone during the safety demonstration, ostensibly to check messages, but she had opened her camera app and was discreetly filming the interaction between Jessica Martinez and the passengers in row 2. Rebecca was 28 years old, a tech entrepreneur who had built her company from nothing, and she had experienced enough discrimination in Silicon Valley to recognize it when she saw it happening to someone else. The safety demonstration concluded, and the flight attendants took their seats for takeoff. The plane accelerated down runway 8R and lifted off into the Arizona morning, climbing steeply over the desert landscape toward cruising altitude. In first class, passengers began the ritual of reclining their seats, pulling out electronic devices, and settling in for the flight to Atlanta. 20 minutes after takeoff, when the captain turned off the seatbelt sign and the flight attendants began preparing for beverage service, the real show began. Jessica Martinez emerged from the galley with her cart smiling and professional, ready to take drink orders from the passengers in first class. She started at the front of the cabin, as flight attendants always do, working her way back row by row. "Good morning," she said to Rebecca Chen in 1A, her voice warm and friendly. "What can I get you to drink this morning?" "Coffee would be great," Rebecca replied. "Black, no sugar." "Perfect. And would you like anything to eat?" "We have some fresh fruit, or I could get you some mixed nuts." "The fruit sounds wonderful. Thank you." Jessica Martinez poured the coffee into a real ceramic cup, not the plastic cups they use in coach, and presented it to Rebecca with a genuine smile. She disappeared into the galley and returned moments later with a small plate of fresh strawberries, melon, and grapes arranged attractively and served with a cloth napkin. The interaction with David Rodriguez in 3B was equally warm. Jessica asked about his preference for coffee or juice, offered him a selection of snacks, and engaged in brief but friendly conversation about his destination in Atlanta. When Sarah Mitchell in 4A requested tea instead of coffee, Jessica offered her a choice of 4 different types and brought her a small plate of cookies without being asked. The pattern was consistent, genuine warmth, professional service, and that little bit of extra attention that makes first-class passengers feel like they're getting their money's worth. Then Jessica Martinez reached row 2. She took David Rodriguez's drink order in 3B, served Rebecca Chen in 1A, chatted briefly with Sarah Mitchell in 4A, and then moved her cart to the next row without making eye contact with Marcus Thompson in 2C. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an oversight. She looked directly at him, registered his presence, and then turned away to serve the passengers in row 5, as if he had suddenly become invisible. Marcus Thompson sat quietly in his window seat, watching the Arizona desert pass by below, and waited to see what would happen next. He didn't say anything. He didn't raise his hand or press the call button, or try to get Jessica's attention. He just waited, because he knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Rebecca Chen in 1A was not willing to wait. She had watched the entire interaction, and her phone was ready. "Excuse me," she said to Jessica Martinez, her voice carrying clearly through the first-class cabin. "I think you missed the gentleman in 2C. Jessica paused her cart halfway to row 5 and turned back with a look of feigned confusion. "Oh," she said, as if noticing Marcus Thompson for the first time. "I'm sorry, sir. What would you like to drink?" But her tone was different now. Cooler, more formal. The warmth that had been there for every other passenger was gone, replaced by the kind of professional courtesy that feels like a wall between two people. "Coffee would be fine," Marcus Thompson replied, his voice steady and polite. "Black, please." Jessica Martinez nodded and poured coffee into a plastic cup, not ceramic, like the one she had given Rebecca Chen. She handed it to him without the small plate of fruit or nuts that she had offered to the other passengers, without asking if he needed anything else, without the smile that had accompanied every other interaction in the cabin. Rebecca Chen was filming it all. The Boeing 737-900 leveled off at 37,000 feet, somewhere over New Mexico, and the first-class cabin settled into that peculiar quiet that happens on morning flights when business travelers are trying to be productive and leisure travelers are trying to sleep. The overhead bins hummed softly with recycled air. The engines provided a steady white noise backdrop. Outside the windows, the landscape below looked like a relief map come to life, all browns and tans, and the occasional green stripe where a river cut through the desert. Marcus Thompson sipped his coffee from the plastic cup and continued watching Jessica Martinez work the cabin. Every 15 minutes or so, she would emerge from the galley to check on passengers, refill drinks, offer additional snacks, or simply make conversation. Her pattern was consistent and revealing genuine warmth and attention for most passengers, perfunctory politeness for him. When Rebecca Chen's coffee cup was half empty, Jessica appeared at her elbow with a fresh pot and a smile. "More coffee." "That would be great. Thank you. How's the fruit? Can I get you anything else? Actually, do you have any of those chocolate cookies? I saw them in the magazine." "Of course. Let me grab those for you." When David Rodriguez needed help adjusting his seat, Jessica was there immediately explaining the various buttons and settings with patience and professionalism. When Sarah Mitchell's headphones tangled, Jessica helped untangle them and even offered to bring her a backup pair from first-class supplies. But when Marcus Thompson's plastic cup sat empty for 45 minutes, Jessica Martinez walked past his row 6 times without offering a refill. It was masterful in its subtlety. She wasn't ignoring him completely, which would have been obvious and actionable. She wasn't being openly rude, which would have violated company policies. She was simply providing him with the minimum level of service required, while going above and beyond for everyone else. It was the kind of discrimination that happens thousands of times a day in restaurants and hotels and retail stores across America, so common that most people don't even recognize it as discrimination. But Rebecca Chen recognized it. She had her phone out again, this time openly recording, and she wasn't being subtle about it. "This is Rebecca Chen coming to you live from 37,000 feet, she said softly into her phone camera. "I'm on SkylineUS Airways Flight 847, and I'm watching something that I think you all need to see." She turned the camera toward the first-class cabin, being careful not to show other passengers' faces clearly, but capturing the general atmosphere and the ongoing interaction between Jessica Martinez and the passengers. "I've been watching our flight attendant for the past hour," Rebecca continued in a whisper, "and there's a clear pattern in how she's treating passengers. Watch this." She filmed Jessica Martinez refilling coffee for the passenger in 4A, offering additional snacks, engaging in friendly conversation. Then she filmed the same flight attendant walking past row 2 without making eye contact with Marcus Thompson, whose coffee cup had been empty for nearly an hour. "See that?" Rebecca whispered to her phone. Same flight attendant, same cabin, completely different level of service. And I think I know why. Rebecca's Instagram live stream had started with her usual followers, maybe 50 or 60 people who followed her tech company updates and occasional travel content. But something about this particular stream was different. The viewer count was climbing steadily. 60 followers became 100, then 200. Comments started appearing faster than she could read them. Where is this happening? What airline? Are you filming discrimination in real time? This is why I don't fly. Record everything. Rebecca's follower count was growing as people shared the stream. Her phone showed 347 viewers, then 502, then 891. The comments were coming in faster now. A mix of outraged support and questions about what exactly they were witnessing. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson had finished reading the in-flight magazine, completed a crossword puzzle from his phone, and was now simply sitting quietly observing the dynamics in the cabin around him. He noticed that James Washington in 5C was also watching the interactions with sharp attention. He noticed that David Rodriguez in 3B had put down his laptop and was paying more attention to the flight attendant's service patterns than to his legal documents. Most importantly, he noticed that several passengers were now discreetly recording with their phones. What had started as one tech entrepreneur documenting questionable service was becoming something bigger. Sarah Mitchell in 4A had her phone out pretending to text, but actually recording. A businessman in row 6 was filming through his sunglasses. Even James Washington, the elderly veteran, had figured out how to use his phone's video function and was capturing the systematic difference in treatment. The tipping point came an hour and 15 minutes into the flight when Jessica Martinez made her third beverage service round. She approached Marcus Thompson's row with her cart, and for a moment, it seemed like she might actually offer him the same level of service as everyone else. She stopped beside his seat, looked directly at him, and opened her mouth to speak. "Sir," she said, but her tone was already different from the warm professionalism she used with other passengers. "Can I get you anything? I'd like a coffee refill, please," Marcus replied politely. "And maybe some of those mixed nuts if you have them." Jessica Martinez looked at his empty plastic cup, then looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. It was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around her eyes, a slight downturn at the corners of her mouth. "We're very busy right now," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear that his request was an imposition. "I'll get to you when I can." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Not, "I'll be right back with that," or "Let me grab you a fresh cup," or any of the dozen polite responses that flight attendants are trained to give. Just, "I'll get to you when I can," delivered with the kind of tone that makes it clear that when I can might be never. Then, without waiting for a response, Jessica Martinez turned to the passenger directly across the aisle in seat 2A and transformed back into the warm, professional flight attendant she had been all morning. "And how are you doing, sir? Can I freshen up that orange juice for you?" The contrast was so stark, so obvious, so deliberately humiliating that several passengers audibly gasped. Rebecca Chen's live stream exploded with comments. Her viewer count jumped from 891 to over 2,000 in a matter of seconds. Did everyone see that she whispered into her phone? She just told him she'll get to him when she can, then immediately offered fresh drinks to the passenger right across the aisle. This is textbook discrimination happening live on camera. The comments on her stream were coming in so fast they were impossible to read. "What airline is this? Get her name. Report. This is disgusting. Where are you flying? Someone needs to speak up." But Marcus Thompson didn't speak up. He didn't raise his voice or demand better service or threaten to file a complaint. He simply nodded politely and said, "Thank you. I'll wait." His calm response seemed to frustrate Jessica Martinez even more than an angry outburst would have. She had clearly been expecting him to make a scene to give her a reason to escalate the situation or call for security. Instead, his dignity in the face of her obvious disrespect made her behavior look even worse by comparison. She moved on to serve the next row of passengers, but Marcus Thompson could see her glancing back at him with increasing irritation. What had started as unconscious bias was becoming something more deliberate, more personal. Rebecca Chen's live stream now had over 3,000 viewers and was being shared across multiple platforms. SkylineUS discrimination was starting to trend on Twitter. Comments were pouring in from people sharing their own experiences with airline discrimination, their outrage at what they were witnessing, and their demands for accountability. The story was going viral in real time, 37,000 feet above the American Southwest, and Jessica Martinez had no idea that her career was about to end in the most public way possible. But Marcus Thompson knew. He could see it happening, could feel the energy in the cabin shifting, could sense that they were approaching a moment that would change everything. He just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The confrontation began over a paper napkin. Marcus Thompson had been waiting for his coffee refill for 23 minutes when Jessica Martinez finally returned with the beverage cart. She poured coffee into the same plastic cup she had given him earlier, now cleaned, but still obviously different from the ceramic cups being used by other first-class passengers. She set it down on his tray table with slightly more force than necessary, causing a few drops to splash onto the surface. "Your coffee," she said, her voice flat and professional. "Thank you," Marcus replied. "Could I also get a napkin, please?" It was a simple request, the kind that flight attendants fulfilled dozens of times on every flight. Jessica Martinez looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her cart and pulled out a single paper napkin, placing it on his tray table next to the spilled coffee. "Anything else?" she asked, but her tone made it clear that she hoped the answer was no. "Actually, yes," Marcus said politely. "Earlier you mentioned mixed nuts. If you have some available, I'd appreciate it." Jessica Martinez stared at him as if he had asked her to personally pilot the plane. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, her voice carried an edge that was impossible to miss. "Sir, we're in the middle of service. I have other passengers to attend to. I told you I'd get to you when I could." The exchange was loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly. Rebecca Chen's live stream, now approaching 5,000 viewers, captured every word. David Rodriguez in 3B looked up from his laptop with obvious concern. Sarah Mitchell in 4A stopped reading her magazine entirely and was now openly watching the interaction. But it was James Washington, the elderly veteran in 5C, who spoke up first. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with discrimination his entire life and wasn't about to let it slide. "I've been watching you serve this cabin for over an hour, and that man has asked for nothing more than what you've freely given to every other passenger. Why is he being treated differently?" The question hung in the air like a live wire. Jessica Martinez turned toward James Washington with surprise and irritation, clearly not expecting to be challenged by a passenger. "Sir, I'm providing excellent service to all our passengers," she said, but her defensive tone suggested otherwise. "No, you're not," James Washington replied calmly. "You brought the lady in 1A fresh fruit without her asking. You offered the gentleman in 3B 3 different types of cookies. You've refilled coffee for everyone in this cabin at least twice. But this man has been sitting with an empty cup for over 20 minutes, and when he politely asks for nuts that you've offered to everyone else, you tell him to wait." Rebecca Chen's live stream was exploding. The viewer count had jumped to over 8,000, and comments were flooding in faster than the eye could follow. "Call her out. This is discrimination. Get her badge number. Someone record this. Where is the supervisor?" Jessica Martinez's face flushed red. She was being called out publicly in front of a cabin full of passengers with multiple people recording on their phones. Her carefully maintained professional facade was cracking under the pressure. "Sir, I don't appreciate your tone," she said to James Washington, but her voice was shaking slightly. "I'm doing my job exactly as I'm trained to do it. Your training includes treating black passengers differently than white passengers," David Rodriguez interjected from seat 3B. As a corporate attorney, he recognized discrimination when he saw it, and he wasn't about to let it continue unchallenged. "I didn't say anything about race," Jessica Martinez snapped, but even as the words left her mouth, she realized she had walked into a trap. By denying race was a factor, she had implicitly acknowledged that there was differential treatment that needed explaining. Marcus Thompson, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and carried an authority that cut through the rising tension in the cabin. "Ma'am, I haven't raised my voice. I haven't been rude or demanding. I've asked politely for the same service that you've provided to every other passenger in this cabin. If there's a reason I'm being treated differently, I'd like to understand what it is." The question was perfectly reasonable, professionally stated, and impossible to answer without revealing the bias that was driving Jessica Martinez's behavior. She found herself trapped between her own actions and the growing attention of passengers who were no longer pretending not to notice what was happening. "You're not being treated differently," she said, but the lie was so obvious that several passengers actually laughed out loud. "Really?" Rebecca Chen said, speaking directly to Jessica Martinez for the first time. "Because I've been live streaming this flight to 8,000 people, and the differential treatment is pretty clear to everyone watching." Jessica Martinez's eyes went wide. "You've been what live streaming?" "On Instagram. 8,400 viewers and counting. They've all watched you ignore this passenger, serve everyone around him, and now refuse to provide basic service when he asks politely." The blood drained from Jessica Martinez's face as the full implication hit her. This wasn't just a private confrontation between her and a difficult passenger. This was being broadcast live to thousands of people, recorded from multiple angles, and probably being shared across social media platforms. Her career was being destroyed in real time, and she had done it to herself. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing and trying to de-escalate the situation, Jessica Martinez doubled down. Perhaps it was panic or embarrassment, or the kind of desperate anger that comes from being caught doing something you know is wrong. Whatever the reason, she chose to make the situation worse instead of better. "I don't care who's recording," she said, her voice now openly hostile. "I don't have to justify my service decisions to passengers. If you don't like how you're being treated, you can file a complaint when we land." She turned back to Marcus Thompson, and her mask slipped completely. "And as for you," she said, pointing her finger at him in a gesture that was both unprofessional and vaguely threatening, "maybe if you dressed appropriately for first class, you'd get first-class service." The cabin went dead silent. Rebecca Chen's live stream viewer count jumped to over 12,000 as people shared the clip across platforms. Comments were scrolling so fast, they were just a blur of outrage and disbelief. Sarah Mitchell in 4A gasped audibly. David Rodriguez stood halfway up from his seat. James Washington shook his head in disgust. But Marcus Thompson just looked at Jessica Martinez with the kind of calm that comes from a lifetime of dealing with people who think they're better than you because of what you're wearing or where you came from or what you look like. "What exactly," he asked quietly, "does appropriate first-class attire look like?" It was a perfectly reasonable question that exposed the fundamental absurdity of what Jessica Martinez had just said. There was no dress code for first-class passengers. People flew in everything from business suits to sweatpants, and flight attendants were trained to provide the same level of service regardless of what passengers were wearing. Jessica Martinez realized she had walked into another trap, but instead of admitting her mistake, she decided to dig the hole even deeper. "You know exactly what I mean," she said. And in that moment, With those 6 words, Jessica Martinez crossed a line that there was no coming back from. "You know exactly what I mean." The words echoed through the first-class cabin like a confession. They hung in the recycled air between Jessica Martinez and Marcus Thompson, heavy with implication and impossible to take back. Everyone in the cabin knew exactly what she meant, even if she wouldn't say it out loud. Rebecca Chen's live stream exploded. The viewer count jumped from 12,000 to over 20,000 in a matter of seconds. Comments were coming in so fast they were impossible to read, just a blur of outrage and demands for justice. Screenshots of Jessica Martinez pointing at Marcus Thompson were already being shared across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. SkylineUS discrimination was trending nationally. But the technology and the social media fury were just background noise compared to what was happening in the cabin itself. Something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between passengers and crew, between the woman with the authority and the man in the window seat, who had done nothing more than ask politely for coffee and nuts. Marcus Thompson looked at Jessica Martinez for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that passengers in other rows had to lean forward to hear him. "No, ma'am. I don't know what you mean. Could you explain it to me?" It was a masterful response. By asking her to be explicit about what she was implying, he was forcing her to either back down and admit she had been inappropriate, or to say out loud what everyone already knew she was thinking. Either choice would expose the discrimination that had been driving her behavior throughout the flight. Jessica Martinez realized she was trapped, but she was too angry and too embarrassed to make the smart choice. Instead of backing down, instead of apologizing and trying to de-escalate, she decided to make her meaning crystal clear. "Fine," she said, her voice rising. "You want me to spell it out? People like you," she gestured at his hoodie and jeans, "don't usually fly first class. When they do, it's usually because they've upgraded themselves without permission, or they're using miles they didn't earn, or they're trying to get something they didn't pay for. I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I know the type." The cabin erupted. David Rodriguez shot to his feet. "That is completely unacceptable." Sarah Mitchell was recording openly, now no longer pretending to be discreet. Did everyone hear that? She just profiled him based on his appearance. James Washington's voice carried the authority of someone who had fought discrimination his entire life. "Young lady, you just admitted to treating passengers differently based on how they look. That's textbook discrimination." But it was Rebecca Chen whose voice cut through the chaos with the kind of clarity that comes from being completely shocked by what you're witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said to her phone camera, "we are watching discrimination happen in real time on SkylineUS Airways Flight 847. This flight attendant just told a black passenger that people like him don't belong in first class, and she's doing it in front of 20,000 people who are watching this live." The viewer count on her stream had indeed climbed to over 20,000, and it was still growing exponentially as people shared the link. Comments were flooding in from around the world. "This is disgusting. Get her fired. What is his name? Someone call the CEO. This can't be legal. Press charges boycott. This airline." Jessica Martinez looked around the cabin and saw something that probably should have terrified her. Every single passenger was now recording. Phones were out everywhere, all pointed in her direction, all capturing her meltdown for posterity. She was being documented from multiple angles by multiple people, and her discriminatory treatment of Marcus Thompson was being broadcast live to tens of thousands of viewers. But instead of recognizing the gravity of her situation and trying to de-escalate, Jessica Martinez made the worst possible choice. She decided to assert her authority. "Everyone needs to put their phones away right now," she announced, her voice shaking with anger. Recording crew members without permission is against federal aviation regulations. It wasn't true, of course. Passengers have every right to record interactions with airline employees, especially when those interactions involve potential discrimination or misconduct. But Jessica Martinez was operating on panic and bad judgment rather than actual knowledge of FAA regulations. "I'm not putting my phone away," Rebecca Chen said firmly. 23,000 people are watching this and they need to see what's happening. "Me neither," said David Rodriguez. "This is evidence of discrimination." Young Lady James Washington said, his voice carrying decades of moral authority. "You can't silence witnesses to your own bad behavior." Jessica Martinez looked around the cabin at the wall of resistance she was facing, and something inside her snapped completely. All pretense of professionalism disappeared. All training in customer service and de-escalation went out the window. She was angry, embarrassed, and cornered, and she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. She turned back to Marcus Thompson, who had remained seated throughout the entire confrontation, calm and dignified, despite being the target of her increasingly unhinged behavior. "You," she said, pointing at him again. "This is all your fault. If you had just accepted the service I was providing instead of making demands and causing a scene, none of this would have happened." Marcus Thompson looked up at her with the kind of patience that comes from a lifetime of being blamed for other people's prejudices. "Ma'am, I asked for coffee and nuts. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make demands, and I didn't cause a scene. You did all of that." His calm response seemed to enrage her further. She had been hoping for an angry reaction, something that would justify her behavior, or at least shift some of the blame onto him. Instead, his dignity made her look even worse by comparison. "Don't you dare turn this around on me," she snarled. "You people always play the victim card. You come into first class where you don't belong. You make unreasonable demands. And then when you don't get your way, you cry discrimination." The phrase, "you people," hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped. Rebecca Chen's livestream viewer count jumped to over 30,000. Comments were scrolling so fast, they were just a white blur of outrage. But Marcus Thompson's response was delivered with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "What do you mean by you people, ma'am?" It was the same question he had asked before. But this time the context was different. This time, Jessica Martinez had already revealed her thinking so clearly that there was no ambiguity left. This time, the question was less about clarification and more about giving her one last chance to recognize what she had said and back away from the precipice. She didn't take it. "You know exactly what I mean," she repeated, but this time she said it with such venom that there was no possibility of misinterpretation. That was when Marcus Thompson finally stood up. He rose from seat 2C slowly and deliberately, his full height impressive in the confined space of the aircraft cabin. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect his entire adult life, first as a naval aviator and then as a corporate executive. When he stood, the dynamic in the cabin shifted completely. Jessica Martinez, who was 5 feet 4 inches tall and had been using her position of authority to dominate the interaction, suddenly found herself looking up at a man whose presence filled the space around him. "Ma'am Marcus," said his voice still calm, but now carrying an unmistakable authority, "I need you to step back now." But Jessica Martinez, operating on pure panic and adrenaline, made the final mistake that would end her career and change everything. Instead of stepping back, she stepped forward. I said, "Sit down." The words exploded from Jessica Martinez with the force of 8 years of frustration, 6 weeks of divorce proceedings, and 30 seconds of pure panic. She was no longer a professional flight attendant providing customer service. She was a woman who had lost complete control of herself, her situation, and her career. Marcus Thompson, who had risen from his seat with calm dignity, made no move to sit back down. He simply stood there, tall and composed, looking at her with the kind of steady gaze that had once stared down enemy fighters over the Persian Gulf. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice still impossibly calm, "I need you to step back and take a breath." But Jessica Martinez was beyond reason now. She could see the phones recording her from every angle. She could hear Rebecca Chen narrating the confrontation to over 35,000 live viewers. She could feel the judgment of every passenger in the cabin, and instead of recognizing that she had created this situation herself, she blamed the man standing in front of her. "This is all your fault," she screamed loud enough for passengers and coach to turn around and look toward the first-class cabin. "You came on my plane in my cabin making demands and causing trouble." "I asked for coffee," Marcus Thompson replied quietly. "That's all I did." His continued calm seemed to enrage her even further. She had wanted him to lose his temper to give her something to point to some justification for her treatment of him. Instead, his dignity made her behavior look even more unhinged by contrast. "Don't you dare stand there acting all innocent," she snarled, stepping closer to him. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You came dressed like that." She gestured at his hoodie and jeans, sitting in first class where you don't belong, trying to get special treatment. "I belong wherever I buy a ticket," Marcus replied, still not raising his voice. Jessica Martinez was now close enough to Marcus Thompson that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. Her face was flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Her hands were shaking. Her professional facade had completely crumbled, replaced by something ugly and raw. "No, you don't," she said, poking her finger toward his chest. "People like you don't belong in first class. You don't belong on my plane, and I'm going to make sure." She never finished the sentence. What happened next occurred so quickly that it took several seconds for observers to process what they had seen. Marcus Thompson, who had maintained perfect composure throughout the entire confrontation, took a half step backward to create some distance between himself and Jessica Martinez's pointing finger. It was a reasonable response to someone invading his personal space, a simple movement designed to de-escalate a situation that had already gone too far. But Jessica Martinez interpreted the step backward as defiance, as disrespect, as one final provocation in a confrontation where she had lost all control. Her right hand came up fast and open, traveling in a wide arc that terminated with a sharp crack against the left side of Marcus Thompson's face. The slap echoed through the first-class cabin like a gunshot. For a moment that seemed to last forever, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the aircraft engines and the distant whoosh of air recycling through the cabin ventilation system. Marcus Thompson stood perfectly still, his head turned slightly to the right from the force of the blow, a red handprint forming on his left cheek. He didn't raise his hand to touch the mark. He didn't step toward Jessica Martinez. He didn't retaliate in any way. He simply stood there absorbing what had just happened, and then slowly turned his head back to look at the woman who had just assaulted him. Jessica Martinez stared at her own hand, as if she couldn't believe what it had done. Her eyes were wide with shock, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding about what she had just thrown away. The silence stretched on for another heartbeat, and then the cabin erupted in chaos. "Oh my God!" Sarah Mitchell screamed from seat 4A. She hit him. She actually hit him. David Rodriguez was on his feet immediately, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "That's assault. Everyone saw it. That's assault on camera." James Washington's voice carried the moral authority of someone who had seen too much injustice in his lifetime. "Young lady, you just committed a crime in front of 20 witnesses." But it was Rebecca Chen's voice that carried the furthest broadcasting to over 40,000 live viewers who had just witnessed a flight attendant assault a passenger in first class. Ladies and gentlemen, you just watched a SkylineUS Airways employee physically assault a passenger. This happened live on Flight 847 from Phoenix to Atlanta. 40,000 people just saw this. The flight attendant's name is Jessica Martinez, and she just slapped a passenger who asked for coffee. Her live stream was exploding. The viewer count was climbing toward 50,000. Screenshots and video clips were being shared across every social media platform. SkylineUS assault was trending nationally, alongside SkylineUS discrimination. News outlets were picking up the story in real time. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and ABC were all monitoring the live stream and preparing breaking news reports. But in the cabin itself, the most remarkable thing was Marcus Thompson's response to being assaulted. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at Jessica Martinez with the kind of calm that comes from knowing that justice is inevitable, and said, "Ma'am, you need to step away from me now." His voice carried an authority that hadn't been there before, not because he was angry, but because Jessica Martinez had just crossed a line that changed everything. She had moved from discrimination to physical assault, from a personnel issue to a criminal matter, from a customer service failure to a federal incident. Jessica Martinez seemed to realize this too. The shock on her face was giving way to something that looked like panic, as the full implications of what she had done began to sink in. She had assaulted a passenger on camera in front of dozens of witnesses, with the entire incident being broadcast live to tens of thousands of viewers. Her career was over. Her freedom might be in jeopardy. Her life as she knew it had just ended with the sound of her palm meeting his cheek. I didn't mean," she stammered, but the words died in her throat. There was no explanation that could undo what had just happened. No justification that could make it acceptable. No excuse that could save her now. Other flight attendants were rushing forward from the galley and from the coach cabin, alerted by the commotion. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Professional but tense. "Flight attendants, please report to your stations immediately." Passengers throughout the aircraft were standing up, trying to see what was happening in first class. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely from the routine boredom of a cross-country flight to the electric tension that follows a shocking act of violence. But Marcus Thompson remained perfectly calm in the center of the storm. He stood in the aisle beside seat 2C, the red handprint still visible on his cheek, and waited to see what would happen next. He didn't have to wait long. James Washington in seat 5C, the elderly veteran who had been watching the entire confrontation with growing concern, pulled out his phone and did a quick Google search. What he found made his eyes go wide with shock. "Oh, my dear Lord," he said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Do you know who that is?" He held up his phone, showing a news article from 3 months earlier, with a headline that read, "SkylineUS Airways names Marcus Thompson as new CEO." The photo accompanying the article showed the same man who was now standing in the aisle of Flight 847 with a red handprint on his cheek. The man that Jessica Martinez had just assaulted wasn't just any passenger. He was her boss. The recognition swept through the first-class cabin like wildfire, passenger to passenger, row by row, until even the people in coach were craning their necks to see what was happening up front. "That's Marcus Thompson," James Washington announced to the cabin, his phone held high so others could see the news article. "He's the CEO of SkylineUS Airways. The man who was just assaulted is the CEO of this airline." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after the slap. This was the silence of people trying to process information that didn't make sense, trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they were now learning. David Rodriguez, the corporate attorney in seat 3B, grabbed his phone and did his own quick search. Within seconds, he had confirmed what James Washington had discovered. "Holy shit," he said, forgetting to watch his language in the presence of other passengers. "It's true." Marcus Thompson, 58 years old, former Navy pilot appointed CEO of SkylineUS Airways 3 months ago. That's him. Sarah Mitchell in seat 4A was staring at her phone in disbelief. "I'm looking at the company website right now. There's his photo on the executive page. Same man, same face. Oh my God, she just slapped the CEO of her own company." Rebecca Chen's live stream was approaching 60,000 viewers, and her voice was tight with the kind of excitement that comes from knowing you're witnessing history in the making. "Guys, this just went from bad to impossible," she said to her camera. The passenger who was discriminated against and then assaulted is Marcus Thompson, the CEO of SkylineUS Airways. Jessica Martinez, the flight attendant who slapped him, just assaulted her own boss. This is the biggest airline scandal I've ever seen, and it's happening live. Comments on her stream were coming in faster than humanly possible to read. "No way. This is real. She's fired. Call the FBI. This is insane. Stock is gonna crash. Someone arrest her, best live stream ever. Share this everywhere." But in the cabin itself, the most remarkable thing was still Marcus Thompson's response. Even with his identity revealed, even with the power dynamic completely reversed, even with the knowledge that he could end Jessica Martinez's career with a phone call, he remained perfectly composed. "Yes," he said, simply speaking to the cabin, but looking directly at Jessica Martinez. "I am Marcus Thompson. I am the CEO of SkylineUS Airways." The confirmation hit Jessica Martinez like a physical blow. Whatever color had remained in her face drained away completely. Her knees actually buckled slightly, and she had to grab the back of a seat to keep from falling. The full magnitude of what she had done was finally sinking in. She had discriminated against her own CEO. She had argued with him, humiliated him, and finally assaulted him, all while he was conducting what was obviously an undercover assessment of customer service quality. She had failed every possible test, violated every company policy, and committed a crime against the person who had the power to fire, not just her, but everyone she had ever worked with. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engines. I didn't know." Marcus Thompson looked at her with something that might have been pity. "That's exactly the point," he said quietly. "You didn't need to know who I was. You were supposed to treat every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of what they looked like or what they were wearing. That's not just company policy. That's basic human decency." His words carried more weight than any shouting or threats could have. They were delivered with the kind of calm authority that made it clear he was speaking not just as a CEO, but as a man who understood exactly what had happened and why it mattered. Around the cabin, passengers were processing the revelation in different ways. Some were taking more pictures and videos documenting this historic moment. Others were calling or texting friends and family, sharing the news that they had just witnessed, the biggest airline scandal in recent memory. A few were already on social media posting their own accounts of what had happened. But David Rodriguez, with his legal background, was thinking about the implications that went far beyond social media and career consequences. "Mr. Thompson," he said, standing and extending his hand. "I'm David Rodriguez, corporate attorney with Morrison & Associates in Atlanta. I specialize in employment discrimination cases. If you want to press charges against Ms. Martinez for assault, I'll be happy to serve as a witness." "Thank you," Marcus replied, shaking his hand. "I appreciate that." Sarah Mitchell stood as well. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I recorded everything on my phone. The discrimination, the verbal abuse, the assault, all of it. If you need evidence, I have it." "So do I." said Rebecca Chen, still streaming live. 63,000 people watched this happen in real time. The evidence is overwhelming. Even passengers from coach were making their way forward now, having heard about what had happened and wanting to see the aftermath for themselves. Flight attendants from other parts of the plane were arriving as well, looking confused and alarmed at the chaos in first class. Jessica Martinez stood in the middle of it all, isolated and alone, watching her world collapse in real time. Other crew members were looking at her with a mixture of shock, disappointment, and fear. They knew that what she had done would reflect on all of them, that the entire airline would face scrutiny because of her actions. Marcus Thompson seemed to sense this, and when he spoke again, it was to the assembled crowd of passengers and crew, not just to Jessica Martinez. "I want everyone to understand something," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "What happened here today was the action of one individual, not a reflection of the values of SkylineUS Airways or the thousands of dedicated employees who work for this company. We have excellent flight attendants, ground crew pilots, and support staff who treat every passenger with dignity and respect." He paused, looking directly at Jessica Martinez. "But we also have a responsibility to address discrimination and misconduct when it occurs regardless of who is involved or how it might look publicly. What happened here today was wrong, and there will be consequences." The word consequences seemed to hit Jessica Martinez like another slap. She began to shake visibly, whether from fear, embarrassment, or the shock of realizing her life had just been derailed by her own actions. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, I can explain. I've been going through a divorce. I'm under a lot of stress. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Marcus Thompson looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Ms. Martinez's stress doesn't excuse discrimination. Personal problems don't justify treating passengers differently based on their race. And nothing, absolutely nothing, justifies putting your hands on another person in anger." His words were delivered without malice, but they carried the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. Jessica Martinez began to cry quietly at first. Then, with the kind of broken sobs that come from knowing you've destroyed everything you've worked for, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, more urgent this time. "Flight attendants, please report to your stations immediately. We are beginning our descent into Atlanta." But nobody was moving toward their stations. The entire cabin was focused on the aftermath of what Rebecca Chen was already calling the slap heard round the world on her live stream, which now had over 70,000 viewers and was being picked up by news outlets around the globe. Marcus Thompson looked around the cabin at the chaos his revelation had created and made a decision that would define not just the rest of the flight, but the future of airline customer service across the industry. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the noise and conversation, "I know this has been a disturbing experience for all of you. When we land in Atlanta, there will likely be media attention and law enforcement involvement. I want you to know that your cooperation and testimony will be important, but also that I will personally ensure that SkylineUS Airways makes this right." He paused, looking once more at Jessica Martinez, who was now being comforted by another flight attendant. "What you witnessed today will never happen again on any SkylineUS Airways flight. You have my word on that." The atmosphere in first class had transformed completely. What had begun as a routine Tuesday morning flight from Phoenix to Atlanta had become something unprecedented in aviation history, a live documented case study in discrimination, assault, and corporate accountability, all playing out at 37,000 feet, with tens of thousands of people watching in real time. Rebecca Chen's livestream had become the central nervous system of the story, with over 80,000 viewers hanging on every word and development. Her phone was getting hot from the constant use. But she kept streaming, knowing instinctively that she was documenting something that would be studied and referenced for years to come. "This is absolutely surreal," she said to her camera, keeping her voice low but audible. I'm sitting on a plane with the CEO of the airline, who was just assaulted by his own employee, and I'm streaming it live to 80,000 people. The hashtags SkylineUS Assault and CEO Slapped are both trending worldwide. This is the biggest corporate scandal I've ever seen happen in real time. The comments on her stream had evolved from simple outrage to more complex discussions about discrimination in the airline industry, corporate accountability, and the power of social media to document and expose injustice. This is why we need cameras everywhere. How many times has this happened with no recording? Other airlines are watching. This stock market is going to react. Huge civil rights. Lawyers are taking notes. This changes everything. Around the cabin, passengers were having their own conversations about what they had witnessed. David Rodriguez, the attorney, was discussing the legal implications with Sarah Mitchell, explaining how the documented evidence would make any potential lawsuit ironclad. James Washington, the veteran, was sharing stories with other passengers about discrimination he had faced throughout his life, and how rare it was to see such clear accountability in real time. But the most significant conversation was happening between Marcus Thompson and the other flight attendants who had responded to the commotion. 3 crew members from different parts of the aircraft had gathered around him, their faces showing a mixture of horror, embarrassment, and sincere concern. Mr. Thompson said, "Linda Hayes, a senior flight attendant with 15 years of experience. I am so sorry about what happened. Jessica's behavior does not represent who we are or what we believe in." I appreciate that, Linda, Marcus replied, reading her name tag. "And I want you to know that I don't hold the entire crew responsible for one person's actions. But I do need to understand if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern." The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. The other flight attendants exchanged glances, clearly wrestling with how honest to be with their CEO in this very public moment. It was Michael Torres, a younger flight attendant with 3 years of experience, who finally spoke up. "Sir, I hate to say this, but Jessica has had issues before. Not to this extent, obviously, but there have been complaints. Passengers have mentioned differential treatment. It's been reported to supervisors, but nothing ever seemed to come of it." Marcus Thompson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "How many complaints?" "I don't know the exact number," Michael continued, "but it's been ongoing. Some of us have tried to address it with her directly, but she always had explanations. Difficult passengers' misunderstandings, stress from her personal life." Linda Hayes nodded reluctantly. "There have been whispers among the crew for months. Some of us tried to work around it by switching assignments when possible, but we never thought it would escalate to something like this." The admission created a moment of profound silence in the cabin. What they were describing was a systemic failure, not just one employee's discrimination, but an entire organization's inability to address a known problem before it reached this level. Rebecca Chen's still streaming caught every word. Her viewer count had climbed to over 90,000, and she could see that news outlets were now embedding her stream in their breaking news reports. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News were all covering the story live, using her footage as their primary source. "Guys," she said softly to her camera, "we just learned that this wasn't an isolated incident. Other crew members are saying there have been complaints about this flight attendant's behavior for months, but nothing was done about it. This is looking more and more like a systemic failure, not just one person's bad day." Marcus Thompson processed this information with the kind of strategic thinking that had made him successful in the corporate world. He understood that what had happened with Jessica Martinez was just the tip of an iceberg, and that his response to this incident would define not just his leadership, but the entire culture of SkylineUS Airways going forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the entire first-class cabin, "I want to thank you for your patience and your willingness to speak up when you saw something wrong happening. What you did today refusing to stay silent in the face of discrimination. That's how we create change. He paused, looking around at the faces watching him. I also want you to know that this incident will be thoroughly investigated, not just Ms. Martinez's actions today, but the systemic issues that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. Every complaint that was filed and not properly addressed will be reviewed. Every supervisor who failed to take appropriate action will be held accountable. The promise carried weight because it was being made publicly in front of witnesses and broadcast live to nearly 100,000 viewers. Marcus Thompson wasn't just making a private commitment to improve. He was creating public accountability for himself and his company. Jessica Martinez, who had been sitting in a crew seat with her head in her hands, looked up when she heard her name mentioned. The reality of her situation seemed to be sinking in more deeply with each passing minute. She was facing not just termination, but potential criminal charges for assault. Her actions hadn't just ended her own career. They had exposed systemic problems that would likely result in policy changes across the entire industry. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice barely audible. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Marcus? Thompson looked at her with something that might have been compassion, but his response was clear and final. Martinez, what you can do is cooperate fully with the investigation. Take responsibility for your actions and use this experience to examine your own biases and behaviors. But your employment with SkylineUS Airways is over effective immediately. The words were delivered without anger or vindictiveness, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Jessica Martinez nodded slowly, understanding that her airline career was finished. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach to Atlanta. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. But as the plane began its descent toward Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, everyone in first class understood that they weren't just approaching their destination. They were approaching the moment when this private incident would become a very public reckoning. As Flight 847 began its descent toward Atlanta, the Boeing 737-900 was no longer just an aircraft carrying passengers from Phoenix to their destination. It had become the center of a media storm that was intensifying by the minute, with news outlets across the country and around the world picking up the story of the airline CEO who had been assaulted by his own employee. Captain Robert Hayes, a 28-year veteran pilot, was dealing with a situation he had never encountered in nearly 3 decades of flying. His cockpit radio was buzzing with communications from air traffic control, airport security, SkylineUS Airways operations, and law enforcement, all trying to coordinate their response to what was being called the incident on 847. SkylineUS 847. This is Atlanta Tower, came the voice through his headset. Be advised we have media and law enforcement standing by at your gate. Request you follow ground control instructions precisely upon landing. Copy Atlanta Tower, Captain Hayes responded. Skyline, US 847 understands we have a situation on board, requesting priority handling and additional security at the gate. In the cabin, the mood had shifted again as passengers realized that their arrival in Atlanta was going to be unlike anything they had experienced before. Rebecca Chen's livestream, now approaching 120,000 viewers, had become the primary source of real-time information for news outlets around the world. Guys, I can see Atlanta out the window, Rebecca said to her camera, and there are news vans everywhere. I can literally see satellite trucks and camera crews positioned around the terminal. This story has gone completely global while we've been in the air. The comments on her stream were flowing faster than ever. Every news channel is covering this. CNN has breaking news alert. SkylineUS stock down 8%. FBI getting involved. History in the making, don't stop streaming. Marcus Thompson was on his phone speaking quietly but urgently with what appeared to be his crisis management team. Passengers could hear fragments of his conversation. Full investigation starting immediately. Media statement ready when we land. Legal team standing by. Board meeting within the hour. Jessica Martinez remained in her crew seat now, flanked by 2 other flight attendants who were essentially acting as escorts. She had stopped crying, but her face showed the hollow expression of someone processing the complete destruction of their career and possibly their freedom. Every few minutes, she would glance at her phone where text messages and missed calls were accumulating from friends, family, and former colleagues who had seen the story breaking on social media. David Rodriguez, the corporate attorney, had moved to sit closer to Marcus Thompson and was providing unsolicited but valuable legal advice. "Mr. Thompson, when we land, you're going to be approached by law enforcement about pressing charges. My recommendation is that you absolutely pursue assault charges. Not just for yourself, but to send a clear message about accountability. The evidence is overwhelming, and the public nature of this incident means there needs to be consequences." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate your counsel, David. I've been thinking the same thing. This can't be just about terminating her employment. If we don't pursue criminal charges, it sends the message that assaulting passengers is just a personnel matter." Sarah Mitchell, who had recorded the entire incident on her phone, overheard the conversation and joined in. "I have everything on video, Mr. Thompson. The discrimination, the escalation, the assault. All of it in high definition with clear audio. It's evidence that no lawyer could dispute." "Thank you, Sarah. The documentation from multiple sources is going to be crucial for ensuring accountability and preventing this from happening again." James Washington, the elderly veteran, had been quiet for most of the dissent, but now he spoke up with the wisdom of someone who had lived through decades of social change. "Son," he said to Marcus Thompson, "I've seen a lot of progress in my lifetime, but I've also seen how quickly that progress can be reversed if people get comfortable and stop paying attention. What happened today was ugly, but your response to it, that's going to determine whether this becomes a moment of real change or just another scandal that people forget about in a week." Marcus Thompson nodded respectfully. "You're absolutely right, sir. That's why we're not just going to handle this as a personnel issue. We're going to use this as an opportunity to fundamentally examine and reform how we train, monitor, and hold accountable every employee who interacts with passengers." The plane was descending more rapidly now, and passengers could see the sprawling complex of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport growing larger outside their windows. The terminal building's runways and support facilities that normally looked routine and familiar now seemed charged with significance, knowing that dozens of news crews and law enforcement officers were waiting for their arrival. Rebecca Chen panned her camera toward the windows, showing her 130,000-plus viewers the approach to Atlanta. "We're about to land, and I can see that this is going to be a circus when we get to the gate. The story has gone completely viral while we've been in the air. I'm seeing reports that this incident has already prompted discussions in Congress about airline passenger rights, and the Department of Transportation is launching an investigation." She turned the camera back to herself. "I want to thank everyone who's been watching and sharing this stream. When I got on this plane this morning, I was just planning to document my business trip. Instead, I've ended up live streaming what might be the most significant airline incident in terms of social impact and corporate accountability that I've ever seen." The pilot's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on final approach to Atlanta. Please ensure your seats are in the upright position and your tray tables are stowed. Flight attendants prepare for landing." As the Boeing 737-900 touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport at 1:47 p.m. Eastern Time, exactly 3 hours and 32 minutes after taking off from Phoenix, the passengers of Flight 847 could see through their windows that their arrival was indeed going to be unlike anything they had ever experienced. There were news trucks from every major network, police vehicles from multiple jurisdictions, FBI agents in dark suits, airport security personnel forming perimeters, and hundreds of people with cameras and phones all waiting to document the next chapter of a story that had already changed everything. While Flight 847 was still descending toward Atlanta, the crisis management machinery at SkylineUS Airways headquarters in Dallas was operating at maximum capacity. The 34th floor of the SkylineUS Tower, normally quiet on a Tuesday afternoon, had transformed into a war room with executives, lawyers, public relations specialists, and board members all trying to manage a scandal that was unfolding in real time across social media and cable news. Chairman of the board, Robert Hayes, was in his corner office watching CNN's live coverage of the incident, while simultaneously fielding phone calls from major investors, industry analysts, and government officials. The stock price for SkylineUS Airways had dropped 12% in the 2 hours since Rebecca Chen's livestream had gone viral, wiping out over $400 million in market value. "We need a statement ready the moment that plane hits the ground," he said into his phone to the head of corporate communications. "And it can't be some generic 'we're investigating' nonsense. This happened to our own CEO on camera, with 140,000 people watching live. We need to get ahead of this, or we're going to be dealing with boycotts, congressional hearings, and federal investigations." In the company's legal department, attorneys were reviewing employment records, discrimination complaints, and training protocols, trying to understand how Jessica Martinez's behavior had been allowed to continue unchecked. What they found was disturbing 7 formal complaints about her treatment of passengers over the past 18 months. Multiple informal reports from other crew members about problematic behavior, and a pattern of supervisors either ignoring the issues or providing minimal interventions that clearly hadn't been effective. "This is a nightmare from a liability standpoint," said Chief Legal Counsel Amanda Rodriguez, reviewing the file. "We have documented evidence that we knew about problems with this employee and failed to take adequate action. Every passenger who was mistreated by her in the past 2 years now has grounds for a discrimination lawsuit." The head of Human Resources, Michael Chen, was pulling employment records and training files, preparing for what he knew would be intensive scrutiny from both internal investigators and external auditors. "The training records show that Jessica Martinez completed our diversity and inclusion modules every year, passed all the required assessments, and received satisfactory performance reviews from her supervisors," he reported to the crisis team. But clearly the training wasn't effective, and the performance reviews weren't capturing the real problems. Meanwhile, in the Public Relations Department, Communications Director Sarah Williams was monitoring social media and news coverage, watching as the story spread across platforms and evolved in real time. "Twitter engagement is through the roof," she reported. "We're seeing support for Marcus Thompson and calls for boycotts of the airline happening simultaneously. The hashtags SkylineUS Assault and CEO Slapped are trending in over 30 countries. International media is picking this up as a story about American racism and corporate accountability." She paused to check her phone, where notifications were coming in constantly. CNN, Fox, SNBC, ABC, CBS, and NBC are all running this as breaking news. The BBC is covering it. Al Jazeera has it on their homepage. This is international news now. The magnitude of the crisis was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just a personnel issue that could be handled with internal discipline and a brief public statement. This was a defining moment for the company, the kind of incident that would either destroy SkylineUS Airways' reputation permanently, or if handled correctly become a case study in corporate accountability and meaningful change. Robert Hayes put down his phone and addressed the crisis team. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have exactly 47 minutes before Marcus lands in Atlanta and has to face the media circus waiting for him. We need a comprehensive response plan that addresses the immediate incident, the systemic issues that allowed it to happen, and the long-term changes we're going to implement to ensure it never happens again. He looked around the room at the faces of people who understood that their careers and the future of the company were on the line. This is not about damage control. This is about taking responsibility, making real changes, and rebuilding trust with our passengers and the public. If we try to minimize this or sweep it under the rug, we will be destroyed by social media and the news cycle. Our only option is complete transparency and aggressive reform. Amanda Rodriguez. The chief legal counsel raised her hand. Robert, I need to point out that complete transparency could expose us to significant legal liability. Every statement we make can be used against us in discrimination lawsuits, wrongful termination cases, and potentially criminal proceedings. Hayes nodded grimly. I understand the legal risks, Amanda, but the reputational and business risks of not being transparent are even greater. Marcus is our CEO. He was the victim here, and he's already committed publicly to accountability and reform. We're going to support him completely. Sarah Williams, the PR director, had been monitoring Rebecca Chen's live stream on her laptop. The passenger who's been live streaming the incident is still broadcasting from the plane. She now has over 150,000 viewers, and she's been providing running commentary about corporate accountability and the need for systemic change in the airline industry. She's not just documenting the incident, she's shaping the narrative around it. Michael Chen, the HR director, looked up from his laptop. I'm getting reports from our employee communication channels that crew members across the system are reaching out to management about their own experiences with discrimination complaints that weren't properly addressed. This incident is encouraging other employees to speak up about systemic problems. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. The Jessica Martinez incident wasn't just an isolated case of one employee behaving badly. It was exposing deeper systemic issues with how the company handled discrimination training, accountability, and corporate culture. Robert Hayes stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Dallas skyline while he processed the magnitude of what they were dealing with. All right, he said, finally turning back to the room. Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to immediately announce Jessica Martinez's termination and our full support for criminal prosecution. Second, we're going to launch a comprehensive independent investigation of our discrimination complaint procedures and training programs. Third, we're going to implement immediate reforms to our customer service monitoring and accountability systems. He paused, looking at each person in the room. And fourth, we're going to use this crisis as an opportunity to become the industry leader in passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies. We're going to turn SkylineUS Airways into the airline that other companies study when they want to understand how to handle diversity, inclusion, and accountability correctly. The plan was ambitious, expensive, and risky. It would require admitting to serious systemic problems, implementing costly new training and monitoring systems, and potentially facing years of legal challenges and public scrutiny. But as Robert Hayes looked at the news coverage on his television screen, watching CNN analysts discuss the broader implications of the incident for corporate accountability and civil rights, he understood that ambitious action was their only option. SkylineUS Airways was about to be transformed. Whether they managed the transformation themselves or had it imposed on them by public pressure, government regulation, and market forces, they chose to manage it themselves. Flight 847 taxied to Gate B12 at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport through a gauntlet of media attention, unlike anything in aviation history. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras broadcasting live footage of the SkylineUS Airways Boeing 737-900 to millions of viewers around the world. On the ground, reporters from every major network jockeyed for position behind police barriers that had been hastily erected to control the chaos. Inside the aircraft, passengers could see the circus waiting for them through their windows. Rebecca Chen's live stream, now approaching 200,000 viewers, provided a passenger's eye view of the media storm that had developed during their 3.5-hour flight. "This is absolutely incredible," she said to her camera, panning to show the crowd of reporters and cameras visible through the terminal windows. "When we took off from Phoenix this morning, this was just another flight. Now we're landing into what looks like a presidential arrival." The power of social media to turn a single incident into a global news story is just mind-blowing. Marcus Thompson had spent the last 30 minutes of the flight on his phone with his legal team, his board of directors, and the FBI agents who would be meeting the plane. He had made the decision to press full criminal charges against Jessica Martinez for assault, not just as a personal matter, but as a statement about accountability and the seriousness of passenger safety. "I want everyone to understand," he had said to David Rodriguez and the other passengers who had offered to serve as witnesses, "that this isn't about revenge or making an example of one person. This is about establishing clearly that assaulting passengers is a crime that will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Jessica Martinez had remained silent during the descent, flanked by 2 senior flight attendants who were essentially acting as escorts. She understood that when the aircraft door opened, she would be taken into custody by federal agents and charged with assault. Her airline career was over. Her freedom was in jeopardy, and her actions had triggered a corporate and media crisis that would follow her for the rest of her life. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate at 1:52 p.m. Eastern Time. Before the seatbelt sign was turned off, there was a knock on the aircraft door. Airport security had arranged for law enforcement to board the plane before passengers were allowed to deplane, both to take Jessica Martinez into custody and to provide security for Marcus Thompson. Captain Hayes opened the cockpit door and spoke to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have law enforcement officers boarding the aircraft to address the incident that occurred during flight. Please remain seated while they handle this matter, and then we'll begin normal deplaning procedures." 2 FBI agents in dark suits boarded first, followed by airport security officers and Atlanta police detectives. The lead FBI agent, Special Agent Maria Santos, approached Marcus Thompson first. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Santos with the FBI. We've been monitoring the situation during your flight. Are you prepared to give a statement and press charges for the assault?" "Yes, I am," Marcus replied. "And these passengers were witnesses to the entire incident." He gestured to David Rodriguez, Sarah Mitchell, Rebecca Chen, and James Washington. Special Agent Santos nodded and turned toward Jessica Martinez, who was still seated in the crew area. "Jessica Martinez, you're under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda rights were read clearly and professionally, while Rebecca Chen continued live streaming, providing her 220,000-plus viewers with unprecedented access to a federal arrest taking place on commercial aircraft. Jessica Martinez offered no resistance as she was handcuffed and escorted off the plane, her head down, her career and freedom officially over. The media outside erupted as she was led through the terminal in handcuffs, with cameras capturing every step of her walk from the gate to the law enforcement vehicles waiting outside. The images would be on the front page of newspapers around the world the next morning. Once Jessica Martinez was removed from the aircraft, the FBI agents began taking statements from witnesses. David Rodriguez, as a practicing attorney, provided a detailed, legally precise account of the discrimination and assault he had witnessed. Sarah Mitchell shared her video recording, which provided crystal clear evidence of the entire incident. James Washington spoke about the pattern of differential treatment he had observed throughout the flight. But it was Rebecca Chen's live stream that provided the most comprehensive documentation. Her continuous broadcast had captured not just the assault itself, but the entire pattern of discrimination that led up to it, the reactions of other passengers and the aftermath. The FBI agents requested copies of her footage for their investigation, understanding that it would be the centerpiece of any prosecution. "Ma'am, your documentation of this incident may be the most complete evidence we've ever had in an airline assault case," Special Agent Santos told Rebecca. "The real-time nature of your broadcast, combined with the multiple camera angles and witness testimony, makes this an open and shut case." Meanwhile, outside the terminal, SkylineUS Airways executives had arrived to manage the crisis. Robert Hayes, the chairman of the board, stood behind a podium that had been hastily set up in the airport's press conference room, facing a crowd of reporters and cameras that stretched back beyond the capacity of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'm here to address the incident that occurred on SkylineUS Airways Flight 847 this morning. First, I want to make it absolutely clear that the behavior exhibited by our former employee, Jessica Martinez, does not represent the values or standards of SkylineUS Airways." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "Ms. Martinez has been terminated effective immediately. We are cooperating fully with law enforcement in their criminal investigation, and we support the decision to press assault charges. There is no excuse for what happened, and there will be full accountability." The questions from reporters came rapid fire. "Mr. Hayes, were you aware of previous complaints about Ms. Martinez's behavior? How did this employee continue working despite discrimination complaints? What systemic changes will you implement to prevent this from happening again? Will Skyline U.S. Airways face federal investigation over this incident?" Robert Hayes answered each question directly, acknowledging that there had been previous complaints that weren't adequately addressed, promising comprehensive reforms to training and accountability systems, and committing to full cooperation with any federal investigations. But the most significant moment came when Marcus Thompson himself emerged from the secure area of the airport, flanked by FBI agents and airport security. The crowd of reporters surged forward, cameras flashing questions shouted from every direction. Marcus Thompson approached the microphone with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the entire incident. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am the CEO of SkylineUS Airways," he began. "This morning I was assaulted by one of my own employees while traveling as a passenger on our aircraft. The incident was documented by multiple witnesses and broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of viewers around the world." He looked directly into the cameras. "I want to be clear about something. I was not targeted for assault because I am the CEO of this company. I was targeted because I am a black man who didn't look like what that employee thought a first-class passenger should look like. The fact that I happen to be the CEO is irrelevant to the discrimination and violence I experienced." The press conference room fell silent. What matters is that this kind of treatment is experienced by passengers every day, most of whom don't have the power or platform to demand accountability. Today we're going to change that. By 6 p.m. Eastern Time. On the day of the incident, the story of Flight 847 had become the most discussed topic on social media worldwide. Rebecca Chen's live stream, which had started with 50 followers documenting a business trip, had been viewed by over 2 million people and shared across every major platform. The hashtags SkylineUS Assault, CEO Slapped, and Flight Attendant Fired were trending in over 40 countries. The incident had sparked conversations about racism, corporate accountability, airline passenger rights, and the power of social media to document and expose injustice in real time. On Twitter, the conversation was explosive and multifaceted. Civil rights. Now Marcus Thompson handled that assault with more dignity than I've ever seen. This is what real leadership looks like. SkylineUS Assault Aviation Analyst. Stock market reacting strongly. SkylineUS down 18% in after-hours trading. This incident will cost hundreds of millions. CEO, slapped passenger rights. How many times has this happened with no cameras rolling? Thompson said it himself. This happens every day to people without power. Systemic change. News reporter FBI confirms charges filed against Jessica Martinez for assault. This is now a federal criminal case. Flight attendant. Fired on Instagram. Rebecca Chen's follower count had exploded from 800 to over 150,000 in a single day. Her direct messages were flooded with interview requests from news outlets speaking opportunities from civil rights organizations and collaboration, offers from social media companies, impressed by her real-time documentation of breaking news. "I can't believe what's happened today," she said in a follow-up video posted from her hotel room in Atlanta. "When I started streaming this morning, I was just sharing my travel experience. I had no idea I would end up documenting what's being called the most significant airline discrimination incident in recent history." She held up her phone, showing some of the thousands of messages she had received. "People are calling me a hero, but I'm not." The hero is Marcus Thompson, who faced discrimination and assault with incredible dignity and used it as an opportunity to create change. The heroes are the other passengers who spoke up when they saw something wrong happening. On LinkedIn, business professionals and corporate executives were analyzing the incident as a case study in crisis management and leadership. Marcus Thompson's response to being assaulted by his own employee will be taught in business schools for decades. Instead of seeking personal revenge, he used the moment to address systemic issues and implement industry-wide reforms. Fortune 500 CEO. This incident demonstrates the power of authentic leadership under pressure. Thompson could have used his position to destroy one employee. Instead, he's using it to improve the experience for millions of passengers. Harvard Business School professor. The real-time documentation of this incident changes everything about corporate accountability. Companies can no longer hide discrimination behind closed doors when passengers have the power to broadcast injustice live to the world. Crisis management consultant cable news networks had turned the story into a 24-hour discussion about broader issues of discrimination, corporate culture, and social justice. CNN's panel discussion included civil rights attorneys, airline industry experts, and corporate governance specialists, all analyzing different aspects of the incident and its implications. What we witnessed on Flight 847 wasn't just one employee behaving badly, said civil rights attorney Patricia Williams on CNN. It was a window into systemic problems that exist throughout the airline industry. How many passengers have experienced this kind of treatment when there weren't cameras rolling? On Fox News, the discussion focused on Marcus Thompson's leadership and the appropriate corporate response to discrimination. Thompson handled this perfectly, said business analyst Rebecca Chen. He didn't let emotion drive his response. He focused on accountability, systemic change, and using his platform to address broader issues. This is textbook crisis leadership. MSNBC's coverage emphasized the racial dynamics of the incident and its place in the broader context of discrimination in America. This incident resonates because it shows that discrimination affects everyone, regardless of their position or power, said sociology professor Dr. Angela Davis. Marcus Thompson is a successful CEO, a former military officer, a respected business leader, and he was still treated as if he didn't belong in first class because of his race. International media coverage focused on the incident as a reflection of American attitudes toward race and corporate accountability. The BBC's analysis described the incident as a perfect storm of racism, corporate failure, and social media transparency that has created unprecedented pressure for meaningful change in American business practices. But perhaps the most significant coverage came from industry trade publications, where airline executives and aviation professionals were grappling with the implications for their own companies and practices. Aviation Weekly's editorial stated, "The Flight 847 incident represents a watershed moment for the airline industry. Every carrier must now examine their own training complaint procedures and accountability systems, knowing that discrimination can no longer be hidden or ignored." Airlines for America. The Industry Trade Association issued a statement calling for industry-wide review of customer service policies and discrimination prevention training, acknowledging that the incident had exposed systemic issues that require collective action to address. Meanwhile, competitors of SkylineUS Airways were scrambling to review their own policies and training programs, knowing that public attention was now focused on airline discrimination practices. Delta Airlines announced an immediate review of their customer service procedures. American Airlines committed to enhanced diversity training for all customer-facing employees. United Airlines promised increased oversight of passenger complaint resolution processes. The incident had not just damaged SkylineUS Airways, it had forced the entire industry to confront uncomfortable truths about discrimination and accountability. Social media influencers and celebrities began weighing in with their own experiences and observations. Oprah. The dignity and grace that Marcus Thompson showed in the face of discrimination and assault is inspiring. Real change happens when leaders choose transformation over retaliation. The Rock. Respect to Marcus Thompson for turning a horrible experience into an opportunity to create positive change. This is what leadership looks like. Trevor Noah, flight attendant, slaps CEO, doesn't realize he's CEO. This would be comedy if it wasn't such a serious example of everyday racism. Props to Thompson for handling it with class. By midnight on the day of the incident, the story had generated over 50 million social media interactions, been covered by news outlets in over 30 countries, and prompted discussions in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms around the world. What had started as a routine flight from Phoenix to Atlanta had become a global conversation about dignity, respect, accountability, and the power of technology to expose injustice and demand change. Within 48 hours of Flight 847's arrival in Atlanta, SkylineUS Airways had initiated the most comprehensive corporate transformation in airline industry history. Marcus Thompson, working with his executive team and board of directors, announced a series of sweeping changes that would fundamentally alter how the company operated, trained employees, and handled discrimination complaints. The centerpiece of the transformation was the Dignity Initiative, a $50 million program designed to eliminate discrimination and ensure respectful treatment of every passenger regardless of race, appearance, or economic status. The program included several revolutionary components that other airlines would soon be forced to adopt. First was the implementation of real-time passenger interaction monitoring. SkylineUS Airways partnered with artificial intelligence company TechVision to develop a system that would analyze audio and video from aircraft cabins to identify potential discrimination in service delivery. The system would flag interactions where flight attendants provided different levels of service to passengers in similar circumstances, requiring immediate supervisor review and intervention. "This isn't about spying on our employees," Marcus Thompson explained at a press conference announcing the new policies. "This is about ensuring accountability and consistency in how we treat every passenger. If there are differences in service levels, we want to understand why and address any issues immediately." The second major component was the complete overhaul of discrimination complaint procedures. Previously, passenger complaints were handled through a generic customer service process that often resulted in form letters and minimal follow-up. Under the new system, any complaint involving potential discrimination would be investigated by a dedicated team of civil rights specialists with mandatory response timeframes and detailed resolution tracking. Every complaint will be investigated thoroughly, not just processed bureaucratically, promised Chief Diversity Officer Dr. Patricia Williams, who was hired specifically to oversee the new systems. Passengers will receive detailed reports about our findings and the actions we've taken to address their concerns. The third element was revolutionary changes to employee training. Instead of generic diversity workshops that employees typically completed online with minimal engagement, SkylineUS Airways implemented immersive scenario-based training that used virtual reality technology to help employees experience discrimination from the passenger perspective. "We're not just telling employees not to discriminate," explained Chief Human Resources Officer Rebecca Chen. "We're helping them understand what discrimination feels like, how it affects passengers, and how to recognize and interrupt their own unconscious biases." But perhaps the most significant change was the implementation of passenger advocacy positions throughout the SkylineUS Airways system. The company hired passenger advocates, independent contractors with civil rights backgrounds, who would travel on flights unannounced to observe passenger treatment and report directly to senior management about service quality and potential discrimination. "These advocates answer to me personally," Thompson announced. "They have the authority to intervene in situations where passengers are being mistreated, and their reports come directly to my office. No supervisor or middle manager can suppress or ignore their findings." The financial markets responded positively to the aggressive reforms. After initially dropping 18% following the incident, SkylineUS Airways stock began recovering as investors recognized that the company was taking unprecedented action to address systemic issues and prevent future scandals. "The market is rewarding SkylineUS Airways for their proactive response," noted financial analyst Jessica Martinez. "Instead of trying to minimize the incident or implement cosmetic changes, they're investing heavily in meaningful reform. That kind of leadership typically pays off long-term." Industry analysts were divided on whether other airlines would follow SkylineUS Airways' lead or wait to see if the aggressive reforms were actually necessary. But within a week, competitive pressure began forcing similar changes across the industry. Delta Airlines announced enhanced bias training for all employees. American Airlines committed to hiring passenger experience monitors for their highest traffic routes. United Airlines promised independent review of all discrimination complaints. Southwest Airlines implemented new accountability measures for customer service interactions. SkylineUS Airways has essentially forced the entire industry to raise their standards, observed aviation industry analyst Rebecca Chen. No airline can now claim they weren't aware of these issues, or that comprehensive reforms weren't possible. The most dramatic change, however, was cultural. Within SkylineUS Airways, employee attitudes toward passenger service began shifting almost immediately. The visibility of the Flight 847 incident, combined with the knowledge that passenger interactions were now being monitored and evaluated, created a new emphasis on respectful, consistent service. Flight attendant Linda Hayes, who had been working for SkylineUS Airways for 15 years, noticed the difference immediately. "People are paying attention in a way they never did before," she observed. "We always had policies about treating passengers equally, but now everyone understands that the policies actually matter and will be enforced. The training is more serious, the oversight is more comprehensive, and the consequences for discrimination are clear." The passenger advocacy program was particularly effective. Within the first month, passenger advocates identified and addressed dozens of service inconsistencies, bias incidents, and customer service failures that previously would have gone unnoticed or unreported. Having someone on flights whose only job is to observe how we treat passengers has been a game changer, noted Senior Flight Attendant Maria Rodriguez. "It keeps everyone accountable, and it also helps identify training needs and system improvements we might not have recognized otherwise." But the most significant impact was on passenger confidence and trust. Customer satisfaction scores, which had been declining for 3 years prior to the Flight 847 incident, began improving dramatically as passengers experienced more consistent, respectful service. The changes are noticeable immediately when you fly with them now, said frequent traveler David Kim. The crew members are more attentive, more professional, and there's a sense that they're genuinely focused on providing good service to everyone, not just the passengers they think are important. Social media sentiment towards SkylineUS Airways also began shifting from outrage over the discrimination incident to praise for the company's response and reforms. Travel blogger: flew SkylineUS yesterday, and the difference is remarkable. Professional, respectful service for everyone. This is what accountability looks like. Dignity in flight. Business traveler Marcus Thompson has turned a crisis into an opportunity to transform airline service. Other CEOs should be taking notes. Leadership civil rights advocate SkylineUS Airways is proving that companies can make meaningful change when they're committed to justice over profit protection. Progress. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some employees resisted the increased monitoring and accountability measures, arguing that they felt micromanaged and distrusted. A few supervisors who had previously ignored discrimination complaints were demoted or terminated, creating tension in management ranks. But Marcus Thompson remained committed to the comprehensive changes, understanding that superficial reforms would not address the systemic issues that had allowed the Flight 847 incident to occur. Change is uncomfortable, he acknowledged, in an internal company communication. But the discomfort of accountability is nothing compared to the harm we cause when we allow discrimination to continue unchecked. We're building a company culture that our employees can be proud of and our passengers can trust. 6 months after the Flight 847 incident, Marcus Thompson found himself in a position he had never expected, not just running an airline, but leading a national conversation about dignity, respect, and corporate accountability. The physical mark of Jessica Martinez's slap had faded from his cheek within days, but the impact of that moment continued to resonate through every aspect of his personal and professional life. He had received thousands of letters from passengers, employees, and strangers around the world, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and expressing gratitude for his response to the incident. Mr. Thompson wrote, Maria Santos, a Latina business traveler from Los Angeles. I've been flying for 20 years, and I've experienced the kind of treatment you received more times than I can count. Watching you handle that situation with such dignity, and then seeing you use it to create real change, gave me hope that things can actually get better. The letters filled several filing cabinets in his office, each one representing a person who had felt invisible, disrespected, or discriminated against during air travel. Marcus read as many as possible, understanding that they represented the human cost of the systemic failures that had allowed Jessica Martinez's behavior to continue unchecked. His family had also been profoundly affected by the incident and its aftermath. His wife, Dr. Angela Thompson, a pediatrician who had supported him through decades of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination in the corporate world, watched with pride as he transformed a personal attack into a force for positive change. I've always admired your strength and dignity, she told him during a quiet dinner at their Atlanta home. But watching you refuse to let that incident make you bitter or vengeful, that was something special. You turned hate into hope. His children, both adults with careers of their own, had experienced the incident through social media and news coverage, like millions of other people around the world. His daughter Sarah, a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., called the evening after the incident with tears in her voice. Dad, I watched that stream live, not knowing it was you until the end. Seeing you treated that way was horrible, but seeing how you responded was inspiring. You showed the world what real leadership looks like under pressure. His son Michael, a software engineer in Silicon Valley, had used his technical skills to analyze the social media response to the incident, tracking how the story spread across platforms and evolved from documentation of discrimination to celebration of dignified leadership. The data shows that your response fundamentally changed how people talked about the incident, he told his father. Instead of just outrage about discrimination, the conversation became about accountability, change, and hope. You literally transformed the narrative. Marcus Thompson had also become an unexpected public speaker, receiving invitations from universities, corporations, and civil rights organizations to share his experience and insights about leadership discrimination and corporate transformation. At a Harvard Business School leadership conference, he reflected on the lessons he had learned from the incident. Leadership isn't about how you behave when everything is going well, he told the audience of MBA students and executives. It's about how you respond when you're tested, when you're hurt, when you have the power to retaliate, but choose to transform instead. He paused, looking out at the faces listening intently to his words. That flight attendant slapped me because she saw me as less than human, as someone who didn't deserve respect. I could have used my position to destroy her personally, but that wouldn't have changed the system that created her biases. Instead, we chose to change the system itself. The speaking engagements had evolved into a broader platform for discussing corporate accountability and social justice. Marcus Thompson found himself consulting with other companies facing discrimination scandals, helping them understand that meaningful change required more than public relations strategies and legal settlements. Too many companies respond to discrimination incidents with apologies and promises that they never fulfill, he observed. Real change requires investment, uncomfortable conversations, and willingness to acknowledge that the problem isn't just one bad employee. It's often systemic failures in culture training and accountability. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had deepened his sense of purpose and mission as a corporate leader. Before Flight 847, Marcus Thompson had seen his role as CEO primarily in terms of financial performance, operational efficiency, and competitive positioning. After the incident, he understood that his position carried broader responsibilities for social justice and human dignity. I realized that being CEO of a major corporation isn't just about serving shareholders, he reflected in an interview with Harvard Business Review. It's about using that platform to make society more just, more equitable, more respectful of human dignity. The incident on Flight 847 was horrible, but it gave me an opportunity to use my position for something bigger than profit margins. The personal transformation was perhaps most evident in his daily interactions with SkylineUS Airways employees. Marcus Thompson had always been a hands-on leader, but after the incident, he made a point of regularly flying on company aircraft, unannounced, not to conduct undercover investigations, but to engage with employees and passengers about their experiences. I want every employee to know that I care about how they treat passengers, not because I might be watching, but because it's the right thing to do, he explained to his leadership team. The goal isn't fear of being caught discriminating. The goal is pride in treating everyone with dignity. The approach was working. Employee satisfaction scores had improved dramatically as workers felt more supported, better trained, and clearer about expectations. Customer satisfaction had reached all-time highs as passengers experienced more consistent, respectful service. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from Jessica Martinez herself. 1 year after the Flight 847 incident, the transformation of SkylineUS Airways had exceeded even Marcus Thompson's ambitious expectations. The company had become the gold standard for airline customer service and corporate accountability, with other industries studying their reforms as a model for meaningful organizational change. The Dignity Initiative had evolved into a comprehensive system that monitored, measured, and continuously improved every aspect of passenger interaction. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs, not just for SkylineUS Airways, but industry-wide as competitive pressure forced other airlines to implement similar reforms. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Chief Diversity Officer, hired to oversee the transformation, presented annual results to the Board of Directors that demonstrated the tangible impact of their investments in accountability and respect. Customer complaints involving discrimination have decreased by 94% compared to pre-incident levels, she reported. Employee satisfaction with diversity and inclusion training has increased from 23% to 87%. Most significantly, passengers from minority communities report feeling welcomed and respected at rates comparable to white passengers for the first time in our survey history. The financial impact had been equally dramatic. After the initial stock drop following the incident, SkylineUS Airways had experienced sustained growth as passengers chose to fly with an airline they trusted to treat them with dignity. Revenue had increased 23% year over year, with customer loyalty reaching all-time highs. The market has rewarded our commitment to meaningful change, noted Chief Financial Officer Robert Kim. Passengers are willing to pay premium prices for airlines they trust, and our brand trust scores are now the highest in the industry. The passenger advocacy program had been particularly successful, with advocates identifying and resolving hundreds of potential service issues before they could escalate into discrimination complaints or public relations crises. The program had been so effective that other airlines had begun implementing similar systems, creating an industry-wide culture of accountability. Having independent observers whose only job is passenger welfare has fundamentally changed how our employees think about service, observed Chief Operating Officer Maria Rodriguez. It's not about fear of being caught doing something wrong. It's about pride in being observed doing something right. The academic community had also taken notice of the transformation. Harvard Business School, Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Wharton had all developed case studies examining how SkylineUS Airways had turned a crisis into an opportunity for systematic change. Professor Elizabeth Chen of Harvard Business School, who had spent months studying the transformation, concluded, "The SkylineUS Airways case represents a new model for corporate accountability. Instead of trying to minimize damage from a discrimination incident, they used it as a catalyst for industry-wide reform. It's a masterclass in crisis leadership and organizational transformation." The incident had also sparked broader changes in federal regulation and industry oversight. The Department of Transportation had implemented new requirements for airline discrimination reporting and accountability measures, largely based on the reforms pioneered by SkylineUS Airways. The Flight 847 incident created momentum for regulatory changes that civil rights organizations had been seeking for decades, noted transportation policy analyst David Martinez. SkylineUS Airways proved that comprehensive anti-discrimination measures were not only possible, but profitable. Congressional hearings had led to the Airline Passenger Dignity Act legislation that required all airlines to implement discrimination monitoring systems, establish independent complaint resolution processes, and provide regular public reporting on service equality metrics. This legislation ensures that what happened to Marcus Thompson can't happen to other passengers without consequences, said Representative Angela Davis, who had sponsored the bill. SkylineUS Airways showed us what's possible when companies commit to justice over profit protection. International aviation organizations had also begun studying the SkylineUS Airways transformation as a model for global airline industry reform. The International Air Transport Association had incorporated elements of the Dignity Initiative into their recommended best practices for member airlines worldwide. The impact has gone far beyond one American airline, observed IATA Director General Patricia Williams. Airlines around the world are implementing similar accountability measures because passengers everywhere demand dignified treatment. The technology developed for the Dignity Initiative had also found applications in other industries. The AI-powered discrimination detection system had been adapted for use in hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and other customer service environments, creating a new market for accountability technology. What started as a response to an airline incident has become a tool for promoting equality across multiple industries, noted TechVision CEO Rebecca Chen. The demand for discrimination monitoring technology has exceeded our most optimistic projections. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact had been cultural. The Flight 847 incident had sparked a national conversation about dignity, respect, and accountability that extended far beyond the airline industry. The phrase Flight 847 moment had entered common usage to describe incidents where documented discrimination led to meaningful organizational change. Social media continued to reference the incident as an example of how to respond to discrimination with dignity and how corporations could transform crisis into opportunity. The hashtags "Dignity in Flight" and "Flight Attendant Fired" remained popular ways to call attention to discrimination in the travel industry. The Flight 847 incident changed how we talk about corporate accountability, observed social media analyst Jessica Martinez. It showed that companies can choose transformation over damage control, and that authenticity resonates more powerfully than public relations spin. Employee advocacy groups had also used the incident as an example of how workplace discrimination affects not just individual victims, but entire organizational cultures. The comprehensive reforms implemented by SkylineUS Airways had become a template for addressing systemic bias in corporate environments. Thompson showed that leaders can use their personal experiences with discrimination to create positive change for everyone. Noted workplace equity consultant Dr. Angela Rodriguez. Instead of just seeking personal justice, he leveraged his position to transform an entire industry. The incident had also influenced how business schools taught crisis management and ethical leadership. Thompson's response had become a case study in maintaining dignity under pressure and using corporate power for social good. The Flight 847 case is required reading in our Leadership Ethics course, explained Professor Robert Hayes of Northwestern Kellogg School of Management. It demonstrates how authentic leadership in crisis situations can create lasting positive impact beyond the immediate problem. Exactly 2 years after the Flight 847 incident, Thompson found himself back in Seat 2C on a SkylineUS Airways flight from Phoenix to Atlanta. But the world around him had changed completely. This time, he wasn't flying incognito to assess customer service quality. This time, he was accompanied by a documentary film crew from CNN, a delegation of civil rights leaders, and Rebecca Chen, the tech entrepreneur, whose live stream had captured the original incident and sparked a global conversation about dignity and accountability. The documentary titled "The Slap That Changed Everything." A Flight 847 story was being filmed to mark the second anniversary of the incident and to examine its lasting impact on corporate culture, airline service, and social justice. 2 years ago, I sat in this exact seat and experienced the kind of discrimination that happens to passengers every day, Thompson said to the CNN cameras as the Boeing 737-900 taxied toward the runway at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Today, I'm sitting in the same seat, but the airline industry has been fundamentally transformed. The changes were immediately visible to anyone who had experienced air travel before and after the Flight 847 incident. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with a professionalism and consistency that passengers had never experienced before. Service levels were uniform, regardless of passenger appearance or perceived status. The training, monitoring, and accountability systems had created a culture where discrimination was not just prohibited, but practically impossible. Rebecca Chen, now a best-selling author and sought-after speaker on the power of social media documentation, reflected on how the incident had changed her own life and perspective. When I started live streaming that morning 2 years ago, I had 800 followers and was just documenting my business trip, she said to the documentary cameras. I never imagined that my phone would capture a moment that would transform an entire industry and spark a global conversation about dignity and respect. Her book, Live Witness: How Social Media Can Document Injustice and Demand Accountability, had become required reading in journalism schools and civil rights organizations around the world. The Flight 847 incident had established her as an expert on using technology to expose and address discrimination. The most important lesson from Flight 847 isn't about airlines or corporate accountability, she continued. It's about the power that ordinary people have to document injustice and demand change. Every passenger on that plane had the ability to record what was happening, but it took collective action to make it matter. The documentary crew also interviewed James Washington, the elderly veteran who had spoken up during the original incident. Now 81 years old, he had become an advocate for passenger rights and frequently spoke at events about the importance of bystander intervention. I've seen a lot of discrimination in my life, he told the cameras, but I've also seen how powerful it can be when good people refuse to stay silent. The passengers on Flight 847 didn't just record what was happening. They spoke up, they stood up, they refused to let injustice happen in front of them without consequence. David Rodriguez, the corporate attorney who had served as a witness and advocate during the original incident, had left his law firm to establish the Passenger Rights Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization that provides legal representation for passengers who experience discrimination during air travel. The Flight 847 incident showed us that discrimination in the airline industry was systematic and widespread, he explained to the documentary crew. But it also showed us that when passengers have documentation witnesses and legal support, they can achieve meaningful justice and change. Sarah Mitchell, the business consultant who had recorded the original incident on her phone, had used her experience to become a corporate trainer, specializing in bias recognition and intervention. Her company, Dignity Consulting, worked with airlines, hotels, and other service industries to implement accountability systems similar to those pioneered by SkylineUS Airways. The most important thing people can learn from Flight 847 is that discrimination thrives in silence, she said. When witnesses speak up, when incidents are documented, when there are consequences for discriminatory behavior, change becomes inevitable. But the most poignant moment of the documentary came when Marcus Thompson was interviewed alongside Linda Hayes, the senior flight attendant, who had been working on Flight 847 and had witnessed Jessica Martinez's discriminatory behavior without intervening. I've thought about that day every single day for 2 years, Linda said, her voice heavy with emotion. I saw what was happening to Mr. Thompson. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't speak up. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it wasn't my responsibility. She looked directly at Marcus Thompson. I'm sorry I didn't do more to stop it, but I'm grateful that your response to that horrible experience has made it possible for me to be a better flight attendant, a better colleague, and a better person. Marcus Thompson's response demonstrated the grace and dignity that had defined his leadership throughout the crisis and its aftermath. Linda, what matters isn't that you didn't intervene that day. What matters is what you've done since then. You've become an advocate for respectful service, a mentor for new flight attendants, and a voice for positive change within the company. That's the real measure of character. Not whether we're perfect in the moment, but whether we learn and grow from our mistakes. As the flight continued toward Atlanta, Marcus Thompson reflected on the broader lessons of the Flight 847 incident and its aftermath. I've learned that leadership isn't about avoiding crisis. It's about how you respond when crisis finds you, he said to the documentary cameras. I could have used my position to destroy one employee who mistreated me. Instead, we chose to use that moment to examine and transform the systems that made her behavior possible. He looked out the window at the landscape passing below the same view he had contemplated 2 years earlier, while being systematically discriminated against. The slap that Jessica Martinez gave me lasted for seconds, but the changes that resulted from our response will last for generations. That's the power of choosing transformation over retaliation, of building bridges instead of walls, of using privilege and platform for justice instead of revenge. When Flight 847, the commemorative flight marking the 2nd anniversary, landed at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, there were no news crews waiting, no federal agents, no handcuffs or arrests. Instead, there was something much more powerful, a quiet recognition that change was possible, that dignity could be restored, and that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become catalysts for the best outcomes we could never have imagined. As Marcus Thompson walked through the terminal where Jessica Martinez had been arrested 2 years earlier, he carried with him thousands of letters from passengers who had experienced better treatment because of the changes sparked by Flight 847. Hundreds of employees who had found pride and purpose in providing dignified service, and the knowledge that sometimes justice arrives not through punishment, but through transformation. The last shot of the CNN documentary showed Marcus Thompson standing at the same gate where the original incident had ended, but this time surrounded by flight attendants, passengers, and advocates who had been inspired by his response to turn personal pain into collective progress. Change happens when good people refuse to stay silent, he said to the camera, repeating the words that had become a rallying cry for passenger rights advocates around the world. Flight 847 wasn't just about one incident on one airplane. It was about the choice we all have when we witness injustice, to look away or to look up and demand better. The screen faded to black with text that read, "Since the Flight 847 incident, discrimination complaints in the airline industry have decreased by 78%. Customer satisfaction scores have reached all-time highs. The Dignity Initiative has been adopted by airlines worldwide. Change is possible when courage meets opportunity." But the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics or the awards or the documentary. It was in the millions of passengers who now experienced dignified treatment during air travel, the thousands of employees who took pride in providing respectful service, and the knowledge that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for the best changes we could ever hope to create. The story of Flight 847 had become more than a viral moment or a corporate crisis. It had become a testament to the power of dignity under pressure, the possibility of transformation through accountability, and the truth that change really does happen when good people refuse to stay silent. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power you have to document injustice and demand accountability, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that challenge how we treat each other and remind us that dignity, respect, and justice are not just ideals. They're choices we can make every single day.